for the nice presentation. As I said, Shalom from Israel. I'm very honored to be with you. Our briefing today centers around the issue of Israel and the challenge of the Shi'ite Crescent. As always, I would like to start by some framing, and hopefully by the next 40 minutes, we will discuss one, if not the major challenge, at least from a geostrategic and security perspective, Israel is facing. We'll understand together what are the dimensions of that challenge and where does it stem from. So our story actually starts some 1400 years ago. Islam emerged in the 7th century, the Arab Peninsula. Very quickly, Islam turned into a conquering empire, and very quickly, Islam experienced an inner split. Make a long story short, two camps, major camps in Islam. Majority of the Muslims are Sunnis, about 80%. Minority are known as Shi'ite Ali, the political faction of Ali. The story, very shortly, the fourth caliph, king of the Muslim empire, Ali bin Abi Talib, that was the son-in-law and cousin of Prophet Muhammad, was assassinated. His first wife was Muhammad's daughter. They had together 4 kids. The younger one, his name was Al-Hussein, claimed the crown for himself, following his father and his brother. His opponent argued that the leadership is not about bloodline, it's about the most suitable man for the position. Al-Hussein bin Ali was killed with his followers in a battle in 680. That's the time Islam split. Sunnis are standing for the concept that leading Islam is not about bloodline, it's about the most suitable man for the position. Shiite are standing for the concept that only a male descendant of Ali, the fourth caliph, is entitled to lead the Muslim world. Ever since, Sunnis and Shiites, the gaps between the sides are non-bridgeable, and their history is a history of lulls of animosity and frictions between the two camps, though they are both Muslims. The deepest, or one of the deepest narratives of the Shiites is the one that says, we Shiites, we have been deprived of the right to lead the Muslim world with the killing of Al-Hussein bin Ali. And one day will come and we will take back the crown of leadership that was stolen from us by the loathed Sunnis. And now jumping to 1979, in our times, a very dramatic event in Iran, Islamic revolution in Iran. Iran becomes a Shiite theocracy under the leadership of what is known as the Mullahs regime. Mullahs is the clergy, the Shiite clergies. They are structured like officers in the army. There are different ranks. The founder of the Islamic revolution was Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah was not his name. This is his rank. As a Shiite clergy. And by the way, there is a higher rank, it's called Ayatollah Uzma. One of the leading concepts that guides the Islamic revolution and the Mullah regime in Tehran is the concept of exporting the Islamic revolution in the region and beyond for 2 major reasons. One, by doing that, they position Iran as the superpower in the region. And 2, by doing that, they are making one more step on the way to take back the crown that was, according to the Shiite narrative, stolen from them back in 680. That policy, the exporting of the Iranian resolution, resulted in a very aggressive expansionist policy of the Mullah regime in different parts of the Middle East that was described by King Abdullah II of Jordan as the Shi'ite Crescent. You could see that in front of you of the map, actually a crescent that stretching from the Mediterranean, starting in Lebanon, and if you wish, even in Gaza Strip, going through Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, down towards the Hormuz Strait right here, the Arab or the Persian Gulf, crossing through Bahrain, Yemen, and entering into Africa. This is the famous Shi'ite Crescent King Abdullah was talking about, and he warned, he said, beware of the Iranian hegemonic vision, beware of the attempts of the Iranian to create that crescent. The appointment or the task of expanding the Iranian revolution was appointed to a specific force within the Iranian Revolutionary Guards known by the name of Al-Quds Force. This is a sort of like a spearhead, a very elite power within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. The name Al-Quds given to that unit is not by chance. It is the Arab name of Jerusalem. Later on, we'll see why is it significant. And that force, Al-Quds Force, its role is to expand, to carry out, to implement the Iranian dream of becoming the superpower, the hegemonic superpower in the Middle East. The commander of that force, up until not so long ago, was Major General Qasem Soleimani. You could see him in the upper picture. He was killed by the United States in January this year, and he was replaced by another general that you see in the lower picture. His name is Ismail Qani. The expansion or the creation of the Iranian Shi'ite Crescent is, roughly speaking, based upon a model of expansion that one of its major pillars is the creation of network of proxies, agents in different parts of the Middle East. In a minute, we will talk about it in details. However, there are two major platforms that the Mullah regime was taking advantage of to carry out its expansionist vision. One is the struggle of the Arab world. To be very accurate, in fact, the failure of statehood in the Arab world. Almost across the region, all around, you could see that Arab states are crumbling, are struggling with enormous challenges. As far as the Mullah regime is concerned, this is a good news. Majority of the Arabs are Sunnis, not Shiites, and the Iranians are Persians, not Arabs. So there is an historical animosity between those two camps. For the Mullah regime, the crumbling of the Arab world, a process that was further boosted with the burst of events of mass demonstrations and riots across the Arab world towards the late 2010, known by the name of the Arab Spring. For the Mullah regime, that is a great news, because the more chaotic the situation, the more easier it is for the Mullah regime to go into, and shortly we'll see some examples of that. So this is one major platform the Mullah regime used to enhance and promote its hegemonic vision. There is another platform the Mullah regime used very effectively and efficiently, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To make a long story short, the Mullah regime identified that that conflict is very central in the mindset of the region, of the people of the region, though, of course, there are many other conflicts in the region that by far are larger and much more severe than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. However, the conflict is very much present in the mindset of the people in the region. So the Mullah regime simply positioned itself on the side of the Palestinians, knowing that by doing that, the Mullah regime will harvest political dividends, though, notice that, 99% of the Palestinians are not Shiites, they are Sunnis. But yet again, when the Mullah regime positioned himself on the side of the Palestinians, the Mullah regime knew that by doing that, he is collecting a political dividend. What you see here in front of you, for example, is a poster that was very recently published by the Mullah regime to commemorate what is called Al-Quds Day, the Day of Jerusalem. And you could see very clearly, you may recognize part of the Temple Mount compound. What you see here is the Dome of the Rock. And there are people that you see, some of the people are numbered. These are people that are all actually belong somewhere or another to the structure of proxies the Mullah regime has been establishing in the last decade. Shortly, we'll talk about those proxies. By the way, notice number 10, if you could see that in the shape of a cloud, this is a figure or the feature of Major General Qasem Soleimani that was eliminated by the United States in January 2020. So the Mullah regime was very effectively monetizing, sort of speaking, the story of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, And by the way, the mullah regime couldn't care less about the Palestinians, but for the mullah regime, this is a great pawn or a card to use, and he uses that very effectively. One of the most significant components of the hegemonic vision that the Iranians are trying to enhance is the creation of a land corridor that stretches from Iran, you could see in front of you, crossing through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, here you see Israel, ending right here in this southwest corner of Israel, a place called Gaza Strip in between Israel and Egypt. You could see these logos and symbols. Everything that you see here, all these logos, are logos of proxies, armed militias that are trained, financed, armed, guided by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the Al-Quds Force. If we start from the left-hand side, shortly we will go over and talk about, a little bit about them. You see Hamas and Islamic Jihad right here with the red arrows in Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon, bunch of different militias operating in Syria, including Afghan Shi'ite militias, Pakistani Shi'ite militias. Here you see in Iraq, Iraqi Shi'ite militias. Some of them are also operating in Syria. The model of proxies is one of the most significant tools that the mullah regime uses in order to materialize its hegemonic vision. And it's the same concept, either creating from zero, creating a militia, nurturing that militia, arming it, and so on, or finding existing factors on the ground, like, for example, in the case of Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Palestine, and nurture them to become proxies and subcontractors of the mullah regime. This is a very significant component in the model of the expansion that the mullah regime is applying. And particularly, I want you to remember that specific corridor, this land corridor that connects Iran through the land, through Iraq, Syria, ending in Lebanon. Let us get familiar a little bit with some of these proxies. Starting to the left-hand side, you could see Lebanon, an Arab state that is actually crumbling. The logo that you see beneath is the logo of a Lebanese organization called Hezbollah. It's two words in Arabic, which means the party of God. The Hezbollah in Lebanon was established by the Iranians in 1982, massively armed with the Iranian weapon, guided by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, to the point, actually, the real boss in Lebanon is Hezbollah and the Iranians. Lebanon has a government, which Hezbollah is part of, and it has a parliament, and it has an army and political parties. It's a shell, it's an empty shell. It is basically a state that is taken over from within by the Iranians using the Hezbollah, and the Hezbollah with its weapons dictate the Iranian interest, both domestically and regionally, upon the Lebanese. Today, Lebanon is crumbling. It is on the verge of a civil war. Its economy is totally smashed, growing tensions. And one of the things, by the way, in Lebanon, finally, the Lebanese are starting to demand openly Hezbollah to disarm itself. It may be too little, too late. Just one way or another, Hezbollah is not going to disarm itself willingly, and the Lebanese will have to struggle if they want to reclaim sovereignty over their lost state. Moving to the right-hand side in the center, you see Syria. The mullah regime has been involved in the war in Syria from its very early stage, streaming to Syria the Hezbollah forces from Lebanon, streaming to Syria other Shiite militias, Pakistani Shiite militias called Zinabiyun, Afghan Shiite militias, Fatimiyun, Iraqi Shiite militias. All of those militias, like Hezbollah in Lebanon, massively armed by the Iranians, guided by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. The Iranians send them all to Syria to fight to save Assad regime from falling down. The reason for that, if you go back for a minute to the land corridor map, The reason for that is that Syria is an enormously significant component in this whole structure that the mullah regime is trying to create, connecting Iran to the Mediterranean. In fact, if the Assad regime would have gone down, the whole structure that the mullah regime has been pouring billions and billions to build would have crumbled. Syria is the cornerstone in this structure because in Syria, the headquarters that coordinate the different militias is located or was located. A training camp, bases where you have different Shiite militias present in, factories manufacturing weapons, rockets, missiles, going to Lebanon and other places. Syria is the cornerstone of that structure. So had Assad regime would have gone down, that would be a bad news for the mullah regime. And that's the reason why it has been massively involved in the war in Syria since almost its early phase. Hezbollah forces are in Syria already since the late of 2011, the first year of the war in Syria. If you look to the right-hand side, you could see Gaza Strip, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. As I said before, both are two Palestinian organizations. Hamas is an Islamist Palestinian organization that is coming from the womb of the Muslim Brotherhood. Islamic Jihad in Palestine, IJIP, again, an Islamist, militant Islamist Palestinian organizations, both are Sunnis. Jihad is coming more from the womb of the Salafi jihadi thought. Maybe in one of our sessions we will elaborate on that. Both organizations, again, massively supported by the Iranians, and they are all part of a structure that is known by the name of the axis of resistance. Mihwar al-Muqawama, this is the term in Arabic, and the concept of the resistance in the contemporary Middle East terminology is actually the acronym for the idea that the state of Israel should be eliminated by the use of violence. There should be no compromise, no recognition, no negotiations, and obviously no arrangements or agreement. Israel, according to that outlook, has to be eliminated. The reason for that is that according to the outlook of the resistance axis, Israel is a foreign body that was embedded in the heart of the Middle East by the Western Christian powers, and therefore it is not part of the region, and it has to be outrooted. This is the concept of the resistance, and it became a very powerful slogan in the contemporary and particularly last couple of decades terminology of the Middle East. So all of those factors that you see, these Iranian-backed militias, are part of this axis of resistance. But they are not only bordering Israel, they are also in a remote circles from Israel. For example, we talked before about Hezbollah. Hezbollah, just so you can understand its might, 130 to 150,000 rockets, missiles. Most of the rockets and the missiles of Hezbollah are short range. However, he has in his possession apparently a couple of dozens of heavy rockets to a medium range and even large, long range. These are heavy rockets that has tons of explosive, and obviously they could cause an enormous damage. In fact, the Hezbollah has a military capacity of rockets and missiles only few, if at all, states on this planet has. Everything, of course, is granted, developed, nurtured by the mullah regime. Again, here is some portraits of the militias that I mentioned before operating in Syria, the Afghans, the Iraqi militias, the Pakistani militias. This is the Gaza Strip. Once again, you could see here the different symbols of different organizations in the Gaza Strip. All of them are part of this axis of resistance. All of them vote to eliminate Israel through the use of power. However, as I said before, there are also in a remote arenas from Israel, not only bordering Israel, the challenge is also very valid. Like, for example, in Iraq that you see here on the map in the yellow, and also in Yemen down here. In Iraq, there is a frame of a military power called the Popular Mobilization Units, PMU. In Arabic, it's called the Hashd al-Sha'bi. It is actually a military power that is operating parallel to the Iraqi armed forces. It is kosher, meaning it is a body that works based upon Iraqi law, authorized by the Iraqi parliament. And that body, the PMU, consists of something like 70 different militias, Iraqi militias. Most of them are Shiites. There are some Sunnis and some Kurds. Most of them are Shiites. These militias are funded by the Iraqi government. They are budgeted by the Iraqi government. They are Iraqis. But the major Shiite militias in that structure of the PMU are actually obeying the orders of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. In other words, Iran was able to create itself an armed presence inside Iraq that is funded by the Iraqi government. And that armed presence inside Iraq, acting to a large extent against the interests of Iraq in the service of Iran. Just to show you how distorted is this situation in Iraq. Those militias, the Iraqi militias, are also massively involved in the war in Syria and also threatening openly to attack Israel. The person that you see below to the left-hand side, his name is, or was, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. He was second in command in this frame of those Iraqi militias. He was killed together with Qasem Soleimani by the United States in January 2020. But the Iraqi militias in Iraq also threaten Israel the same way the Hezbollah. We know that in the past, commanders of those militias were patrolling with Hezbollah, with Lebanese Hezbollah people along the Israeli-Lebanese border, where they openly, formally said, when the time comes, we, the Iraqi militias, we will join the war to eliminate Israel. The story doesn't end here. Even in a remote area, thousands of miles away from here, in Yemen, there is another Iranian subcontractor, if you wish. It's called the Houthis. It's a coalition of Shiite tribes in Yemen, mostly based traditionally in the northern part of Yemen. The Houthis are Shiites. They are some 35% of the population. And they also have a very strong army or militias, if you wish. It's called Ansar Allah. Massively supported, trained, and equipped, yet again, by the mullah regime. In 2014, the Houthis in Yemen conducted a military coup. They ousted the Yemenite government. They took over Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and quickly spread their control to different parts of Yemen. They were pushed back partially by a counter coalition led by the Saudis, and the government of Yemen moved down to Aden, which is in the southern part of Yemen, bordering the Gulf of Aden. You could see it right here. And ever since 2015, the beginning of 2015, up until now, there is a war going on in Yemen between the Houthis on the one hand, the Saudi coalition, the Saudi-led military coalition, and the ousted Yemenite government on the other hand, trying to limit and push further up back to the north the presence of the Houthis that are massively supported by the mullah regime. The person that you see in the picture, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, he's the leader of the Houthis. He threatened Israel more than once, and only recently senior officers in the Ansar Allah army, or militia if you wish, also said, we have ballistic missiles that could reach to Tel Aviv and north of Tel Aviv. Once again, the Yemenite Houthis are part of this structure that was built by the mullah regime. Once again, you could see the big picture in front of you, the militias scattered here up in the land corridor from Iran all the way to Gaza Strip, the Iraqi threat that I mentioned before, and Yemen down here, the Houthis that also joined the party to threaten Israel from distance. Another major component in the expansion model of the Iranian regime is the story of the nuclear program. You are quite probably aware of that topic. Just to mention, in 2015, an agreement was signed between Western powers, then led by President Obama's administration, and the Iranians. It's called the JCPOA, Joint Cooperation Plan of Action, that actually was supposed to make the Iranians more reasonable player. The fact is that, unfortunately, following the agreement, the Iranian regime boosted its aggression in different parts of the Middle East. It becomes more and more lethal. It becomes more and more violent, to the point, for example, in February 2018, before President Trump withdrew from this agreement, in February 2018, Iran, for the first time ever, directly attacked Israel militarily from Syria. Directly, because up until then and today, Iran is using all the time the proxies to do the dirty job. Following the signing of the JCPOA in 2015, the Iranians' aggression increased in the area of the Gulf area. You could see it here on the map. It increased its aggression right here in the Red Sea, in that enormously strategic passage that you see right here. It's called Bab el-Mandeb. Bottom line, the JCPOA agreement perhaps was motivated by good ideas or good attempt of the negotiators, the Western negotiators, a goodwill. They maybe thought that by signing an agreement with the Iranian, by extending hands to the Mullah regime, by rapprochement, the Mullah regime will become a reasonable player. Unfortunately, the outcome was totally the opposite. The Mullah regime intensified its aggression in different parts of the Middle East, actually dragging the region more and more into a massive burst of violence. The Iranian presence in Syria that I described before, and the whole plan of the corridor that I explained earlier, that the Mullah regime, one of its major pillar of one of its expansion policy. The presence of the Mullah regime in Syria presents Israel with a challenge, a security threat that I say responsibly, nothing less than an existential threat. It is part of an actually larger master plan of the Mullah regime, a blueprint, if you wish, going back to that map, where actually what the Iranians are trying to do is, by creating a military presence in Syria, combined of dozens of thousands of Shiite militants, together with deployment of dozens and dozens and dozens of thousands of rockets and missiles, including high precision missiles, heavy missiles with a very high level of accuracy. In the Iranian master plan, this is a component that is supposed to join two other components that already exist to a certain extent. One is the Hezbollah in Lebanon, right here, and the other one is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Gaza Strip. And the idea is actually to create a strangling loop around Israel's neck, starting in Lebanon, circling Israel from the east, Syria, ending down in Gaza Strip, a strangling loop that consists of endless numbers of rockets and missiles, dozens and dozens of thousands of militants that are sitting on Israel's borders. And actually the idea is to simply grind Israel to dust. either in a repeating military rounds that will exhaust Israel time and again, or just in a one major coordinated attack where dozens of thousands of missiles and heavy missiles and rockets will rain down, pour down on Israeli cities, infrastructure, airports, ports. You understand the ramifications of something like that. In the face of that huge challenge, Israel is determined to prevent the mullah's regime plan at all costs, whatever the cost is going to be. And as part of that, one of the major military campaign Israel is conducting constantly, it's called the battle between the battles, or the battle between the wars, is a constant military effort to damage, to destroy, to intercept the Iranian presence, military presence in Syria. That explains the fact that Israel thus far has been attacking the Iranians and their proxies in Syria hundreds of times, and Israel will attack hundreds of times more if needed to intercept the Iranian master plan. There was a time Israel did not admit any responsibility for those mysterious attacks, but that policy was changed in the last couple of years. Israel openly admitted it is attacking in Syria, and it will continue to attack whenever and wherever Israel will decide it needed in order to intercept the Iranian plan. The Iranians, one of the things that they are trying to enhance is a high precision project, meaning to make the missiles and the rockets that Hezbollah has in its possession accurate, meaning adding sort of a device that will basically make those missiles to a missiles that can hit from hundreds of miles away in an accuracy of 10 meters. This is, of course, a very severe threat to the state of Israel, and that's the reason why, one of the major reasons why Israel is attacking the Iranian forces and their proxies in different parts of Syria and other places as well. If you look at this map, you could see something very significant here. This is Syria. You could see Syria now. We are kind of like enlarging the map, and now we could see Iraq bordering Syria from the east. You could see all these routes that are, all these routes that are colored green and other colors. They are standing for potential land corridors that the Iranians could use potentially in order to try and to stream through the land from Iraq missiles and militants and so on and so on. Practically speaking, the major land corridor the mullah regime is trying to operate is the one that is crossing from, roughly speaking, the area of the center where the Iraqi and Syrian borders meets. It's this place right here. This is where the Euphrates River is crossing from Syria to Iraq. This is a place that became very significant in the sense of Israel's attempt to intercept the Iranian plan. Going back, you could see it right here on this map. You could see right here the reds that stand at this part of Syria, the eastern part. This is the crossing place to Iraq. Right here, there is a border crossing between Syria and Iraq. You could see by the logos and signals here and signs here that this is a place that was also exposed to an attack more than once, and reportedly those attacks were carried out by both Israel and the United States. What's the purpose of the attacks on this place, which is relatively remote from Israel? Because if you look at the map, if you look right here to the left-hand side, you could see this is the blue lines here. It's the Golan Heights, the Israeli part. This is the eastern part of Syria. There are a couple of hundreds of miles distance between the two. But this is a very significant place. The border crossing because between Syria and Iraq. And let me explain to you why. To that end, Let me stop sharing for a minute this map, and I'll share with you something else that shows it. I hope that you could see this satellite image. This satellite image shows you the area that the crossing between Syria and Iraq. What I wanted to show you here in this place, you could see this pink line that stands for the border between Syria and Iraq. You could see the path right here. You could see this place here called Al-Qaim. This is the name of the passage on the Iraqi side. This is the Iraqi side. Here on the left-hand side, you could see it's called Abu Kamal. It has two names. This is the Syrian side, and this is the Iraqi side. Here is the border crossing right here. We'll now zoom in, and we'll get closer. And now what I want to show you is that compound. This is a compound, a military compound established by the Iranians. It's called Imam Ali compound. It serves as a logistics and maybe more transition point where actually the weapons, the militants that the Iranians are streaming or trying to stream to Syria, which is here, from Iraq, which is here, that compound right here, the Imam Ali compound, is a very significant point on that route. If I'll just zoom out a little bit, once again, what you see here, this is the Iraqi side of the border crossing. This is already the Syrian side. Abu Kamal is right here. And the compound that I showed you before, Imam Ali compound, is the compound that you see right here. This area has been attacked a couple of times. And as I said before, according to different sources, the attacks were carried out either by Israel or the United States. Going back to our presentation, towards the concluding of our presentation, as I said before, the land corridor that the Mullah regime is trying to establish, going back to the map right again in front of you, presents Israel with a very significant geostrategic security threat that Israel is determined to intercept and prevent at all costs. In that context, as I said before, Israel has been attacking, as it says, hundreds of times Iranians and their presence proxies in Syria. Just to conclude our presentation, I will share with you a short video showing one of those attacks carried out by Israel against the Iranian presence in Syria. With your permission in a minute, I will just log in and share it with you. This is documentation of one of the attacks. The black line that you see is a rocket that is launched from the anti-aerial defense batteries on the ground in Syria, trying to intercept incoming Israeli missile. In a minute, you will see the impact. Now you could see another attack, this time another battery that was also attacked by Israel, taken out. That is the story of the Israeli challenge, what we call the northern front of Israel. Actually, I'm always saying, when people think about the north, I think that it's important to understand. Let me go back to our map just to reiterate what I said before. I think it's important to understand that Israel's actually major or real borders is not only in Lebanon or Syria. Because when you look back on the map, as I mentioned before, as I showed you before, you could see that actually the borders of Israel are stretching far and wide away from Israel. Let's go back to the map just to get once again the dimension. Today, to a large extent, Israel's eastern border, Israel is right here, is Iran. And Israel's southern border is Yemen. From a geostrategic perspective, again, given to the scale and dimension that the Iranian hegemonic vision, the Shi'ite Crescent, presents. the threat, the severe, very severe threat it presents the state of Israel with. Here I'm concluding my presentation, and you are very welcome, of course, to share with me your questions, comments, and so on.
Thank you so much, Avi. So please, anyone that have any questions, if you can write the question in the chat or text me. So in this way, we can coordinate all the questions and maybe merging many of them in once. Also, I would like to take the opportunity to remind all of you that Avi will be again with us on Sunday, August 30 at 10 a.m. And the topic will be Turkey, the influence of Turkey in the Middle East. That will be the third part of the series about the Middle East. That will be on Sunday, August 30. So if anyone has any question for Avi, please feel free to ask the question. Don't be so shy.
Guess people are trying to digest.
Okay, I have one question for you, Avi. What role is Russia playing here? And I would like also to add also China. What role are China and Russia playing here?
Okay, thank you for the question. Let me again share the screen with you and go back to our map. Let me start with Russia. Russia plays a very significant role. You know, the Middle East is going through a lot of turbulences in the last decade and so. But if there is one player that at this point you could definitely say that it's gaining a lot out of that, it's definitely Russia. I was talking about Syria earlier and the war in Syria and why it's so important to the Iranians to make sure that Assad regime will be in power. In 2015, Assad and the Iranians were in a very dire situation. The rebels in Syria had the upper hand. They were gaining momentum. The Iranians and Assad desperately turned to Putin and asked for his intervention, militarily direct intervention. Putin replied positively. He sent his air force, and actually he was able to turn the tables, turn the tide in Syria. But Putin is a strange fellow. He does not give free meals. And actually what Putin got is basically presence in Syria. It has two military bases in Syria, a naval one and an aerial one. He signed a lease for the next 50 years with Assad. Putin is the one that actually holds Assad in power, as well as the Iranians. Without Putin aerial umbrella, they could not defeat the rebels on the ground. Now, Putin, and this is an interesting situation, though Putin is in the same side of Assad and the Iranians in the context of the war in Syria, Putin definitely does not share the same interest of the Iranians. In fact, there is a lot of tension between Putin and the Iranians because now as Assad, thanks to Putin mostly, was able to restore some control over large parts of Syria, Putin is now starting to prepare itself to the time following after the war where he could start collect the dividends. And in that sense, Putin has no special desire to share the cake with Iran. And as a matter of fact, as I said before, you can go back to the map that I showed you before, the map with the that shows the attacks that Israel conducted in Syria, targeting the Iranian presence in Syria. Israel conducted hundreds of times attacking the Iranians and their proxies in Syria sometimes very close to the Russian presence. The Russians are basically sitting and looking to the other side. Putin shed no tear when he see the Iranians and their proxies in Syria sustaining constant slaps, painful slaps from Israel. Putin definitely shed no tears about that. And Putin in that context is very significant because he's tuned to the Israeli message. And he knows what's Israel's ultra strategic interest, as I said before, to prevent the Iranian plan in Syria. And Putin understands that, and he knows that Israel is serious about it, and it will do whatever it takes at all costs, Israel, I mean, to prevent the Iranian plan in Syria. In addition to that, Putin also gained an access to the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, a very significant region because it contains huge gas reservoir. It's going to become a very significant component in the international and global energy market. So Putin, by having presence in Syria, reminding you, naval and aerial bases in Syria, obviously get a great place, a great position. And of course, he's going to use that to extend, he's already doing that, to extend and expand its influence different parts of the region. Russia is back in the Middle East, and it's back to stay in the Middle East as far as the eye can see. There is another player that is coming to the region. It's called China. The Chinese are more and more interested in parts of the Middle East as part of their geostrategic master plan called One Belt, One Road, where the Chinese that are massively invested in Africa are more and more now invested in the Middle East, including, by the way, to a large extent in Israel. I'm talking about harbors, I'm talking about transportation, communication, and other major projects that the Chinese are invested in. They are massively invested in the area of the Gulf, and they are the biggest oil consumer or the biggest client of Iran for oil. So in other words, the Chinese are a major player. Of course, they just recently signed a big, huge deal with Iraq. Iraq is the fourth largest oil producer in the world. The Chinese signed an agreement with the Iraqi government that the Chinese will rebuild the whole Iraqi oil infrastructure, and in return, they will get for the next generation a cheap Iraqi oil coming into China. The same they are doing with the Iranians. China is the new global player, of course. It's the giant that is expanding its presence around the globe, including, of course, the Middle East. And as I mentioned before, by the way, regardless of the size gaps between China and Israel, the Chinese are very much interested in Israel, and there is a growing and strong, tight cooperation between the two. China is definitely one of the major superpower of the 21st century that will shape to a large extent the trajectory of this region.
Another question is the US doing anything to influence events here?
Well, generally speaking, I would say that there are two major approaches within the American administrations. I'm saying administrations, I'm talking mostly the previous one, President Obama and the current President Trump. The two conflicting trends are one to stay and the other one is to leave. One is advocating that the United States should increase and boost its presence in the Middle East because it is a significant interest for the United States. The other one says the United States should basically shrink its presence and leave the region because according to that outlook, the Middle East is becoming less and less relevant to the United States. It's an area that is kind of like almost a totally lost case. The United States should not be the police officers of this place. You are familiar with all this argument. However, as of now, particularly under the Trump administration, Trump administration took a 180 degrees shift towards the region, and particularly in the context of the policy towards Iran. As I mentioned before, the previous administration, the Obama's administration, definitely reached out to the Iranians, conducted a rapprochement, a peacing policy towards the mullah regime. As I said before, unfortunately, the expectations that were under that policy or fueling that policy, the expectations that the Iranian will become more reasonable players, unfortunately, were wishful thinking. They crashed on the rocks of the reality, as I mentioned before, following the signing of the JCPOA before even Trump administration came to power. The mullah regime was boosting its aggression in different parts of the Middle East. Trump administration took a 180 degrees shift. Is applying a maximum pressure on the Iranian regime, rightly so, identifying the danger that that regime presents to the Middle East, including the interests of the United States. In that sense, by the way, the United States, obviously, in addition to its traditional allies in the region, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Egypt, to a certain extent, even though there are lulls of tension between the two sometimes. The United States maintain today a presence in different parts of the region which are significant, enormously significant. Obviously, the fleet, the US fleet that in Qatar, another significant location is the area that is called Tanaf. It is the triangle border between Syria, you could see here, Jordan and Iraq. This triangle, there is a base here, there is an American presence. Another significant area is in Iraq, US military presence in Iraq, particularly air power. This is very significant. And also, of course, in Israel and the Mediterranean. The US military presence is enormously significant in the sense of the ability to secure and to act swiftly if needed to secure Americans and American allies' interest in the region. So in that sense, yes, the US has today a significant military presence, not necessarily in terms of boots on the ground, but definitely in terms of firepower that could be very substantial and lethal and could be operated in a short notice. Just the other day, Israel and the United States actually signed a memorandum of mutual aerial defense deployment systems, which is part again of the preparation, sort of speaking, in the face of the major rockets and missiles threat that Israel is facing. Not only Israel, of course, others in the region already had to taste the bitter fruit of the Iranian aggression, reminding you the Iranian attack on Aramco in Saudi Arabia using cruise missiles, advanced cruise missiles, attacks carried out by the Iranians and their proxies in the Gulf, in the area of the Hormuz Strait, in the area of the Gulf of Oman, in the area of Bab el-Mandab, the Red Sea. These are all challenges that has to be met. In that sense, the US has today, under the current administration, military presence that is significant and not less significant. The guiding policy of the Trump administration, meaning identifying the threat that Iran presents rightly and accurately as the most significant threat to the region, these are two major components in the current US policy and activity in this part of the world.
I have two more questions. The first one is, how significant is the US presence in Bahrain and Djibouti? And the second question is, what happened with the Al-Qaeda presence and other extreme movement presence in the Sinai Peninsula? How they play in the big chess game with Iran?
Well, regarding the US presence, as I said before, the presence of the US in the region is very significant. I refer to the military capacities, the American fleet in Bahrain, the aerial power of the United States. So I think that unless there was another kind of question, I wouldn't like to reiterate it. Unless there was, could you repeat the question about America?
Which one?
The first one about the states.
How significant is the US presence in Bahrain and Djibouti?
Well, yes, as I said before, I was right. I mean, I did say it's very significant, not necessarily in terms of boots on the ground, but in terms of firepower, the ability to strike and to have a very significant power using advanced technologies and sort of. The American presence is very significant in that sense. And of course, it's very important. Regarding the second question about Al-Qaeda and other militant Islamist groups, well, they are here to stay. Those groups are not going to evaporate. As long as the challenges continue in the Muslim and the Arab world, those groups will continue their activities. They are fed by the disachievements, the poverty, the neglectance, the violence, and many other negative phenomena that unfortunately are very much spread in the Muslim and the Arab world. So as long as those challenges are there, those groups are there. You mentioned Sinai Peninsula. It's yet continue to be in a region or an area where ISIS-affiliated groups are operating. By the way, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are on a kind of like a friction or a collision track between the two. Though ISIS is actually originally an offspring of Al-Qaeda, there is tension between the two groups. Actually, they are fighting for the same niche, roughly speaking. As ironic it may sound, ISIS criticism of Al-Qaeda is that Al-Qaeda is not strict enough. While on the other hand, Al-Qaeda argues that ISIS brutality, mostly targeting Muslims, is totally unacceptable. In other words, these groups and many others, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, endless numbers of militant Islamist, Salafist, jihadist groups continue their operation, continues their activities. By the way, their activity is spread to Africa, of course, the western part of Africa, Southeast Asia, Central Asia. The challenge those groups present is severe, it's real. They are here to stay with us for a long period of time. Though ISIS lost its stronghold on the ground, the one that he established called the Islamic State in parts of Syria and Iraq, by 2019, he lost that as an outcome of the massive attacks, the international coalition. ISIS did not disappear. So it should be clear for everyone, as I said before, all those groups, their ideology, their modus operandi, unfortunately will continue to be part of our lives for many, many years to come.
Thank you so much, Avi. Just a reminder for all of you, the third session of this series with Avi will be on Sunday, August 30 at 10 a.m. and will be about Turkey in the Middle East. Also, the first week of September, Temple Israel will organize a vast virtual tour in Israel with Cheyenne. 4 days, an hour each day. There will be 25 spots, and the family unit price will be $50. You will receive very soon, next week or in 2 more weeks at most, an email with all the information in case that you want to register. Thank you so much, Avi. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating and entering in this program. And hopefully I will see all of you at the end of the month. Thank you so much, Avi. Thank you, everyone.
Shalom from Israel.
Have a
Thank
good
you.
day.
Thank you.
Shalom.